What are the top 10 nutrition myths that nutrition experts wish would go away? I'm Dr. Eric Westman, and welcome back to another Dr. Westman Reacts. If you don't have my top 10 tips on how to start keto right, look in the description below. I was sent this video from Nutrition Made Simple, Dr. Gil Carvalho, and he is reviewing an article where the experts were asked what nutrition myths they wish would go away. I have several of mine, like, I wish doctors would understand the keto diet and not think it would automatically kill you if you didn't eat carbs for a few days. So I'm kind of expecting a few of those questions. But I also want you to also consider the source. So Dr. Gil Carvalho, best I can tell, is not a practicing physician, but he's very academic. He is going to review articles, and I like that a lot. But the lack of a clinical sense about things, is going to get some kind of crazy thoughts perhaps, or less pragmatic solutions for things. In looking at his background, he is a member of what's called the True Health Initiative. And I remember this, a doctor came to my office and said, a younger doctor said, why don't you sign up for the True Health Initiative? All of the experts are. And I said, well, okay. So I went to the True Health Initiative, and in her presence, this other doctor, and I went to sign up, and I put in my name and all this, and it makes you take a pledge. So the pledge to join the True Health Initiative, and it's at their website in plain sight. Number one, the healthiest, longest lived populations around the world, the blue zones, do not particularly fixate on any particular theory, fad, book, food, nutrient, or ingredient, but rather practice the fundamentals of health-promoting lifestyle promulgated by their cultural norms. I could sign off on that. These practices include, bullet number one, a diet comprised mostly of minimally processed, generally plant-predominant foods in time-honored, balanced... Wait a sec. It's the plant-based bias coming in here again. In the presence of this other doctor, again, I want to join the team of experts who are looking at food in an unbiased way. She looked at me and said, you can't sign that. And I said, no. So I didn't join. But Dr. Carvalho is a member of that. And now some people don't take pledges as firmly or as seriously as others. And maybe he's not a plant-based promoter, or they didn't use the term plant-based. It was plant-predominant food. So anyway, it's percolating through the culture, you can eat and be healthy in lots of ways, including eating animal products, animal sources of food. I believe the science says that. But back to the video. So this is the 10 nutrition myths experts wish would die.
Super interesting article just came out in the New York Times where they asked 10 nutrition scientists about their pet peeves, the common nutrition myth they wish would die. I already went through, I agree with some, I have questions about others, so let's take a look. Myth number one, fresh fruits and vegetables are always healthier than canned, frozen, or dried. Yeah, I agree this is a myth. There are specific studies looking at this and measuring, and in general, freezing is pretty good at keeping nutrient content. Sometimes it's even better than buying fresh, because in reality, we don't eat everything the day we buy it. It sits in the fridge for a couple days, and by the time we eat it, the frozen product may actually have more nutrition preserved because it degrades slower. So studies have actually measured and shown that. Now, leafy greens may be a bit of an outlier. Freezing things like spinach can cause some nutrients, like some vitamins, for example, their level can come down by 25% or so. But depending how long your vegetables sit in the fridge, if you buy them fresh, the difference between refrigerated and frozen isn't that big. The other factor, of course, is waste. Sometimes vegetables sit in the fridge too long, they go bad, and we have to toss them. So buying frozen can actually result in saving some ka-ching and of course less environmental impact because that's less food that gets produced only to be thrown away. Now one cat.
Well, so that kind of took me off guard. The nutrition experts are thinking that one of the main myths is that people believe fresh fruit and vegetables are healthier than canned or frozen fruits and vegetables. To me, well, in the kind of approach that I teach, you'll laugh with me, I don't really want people to eat much leafy greens or non-starchy vegetables at all. So the idea that this would be number one on my top nutrition myth caught me off guard. That it doesn't matter. It's nice to know that frozen vegetables are going to be as healthy, but I'm not sure you need much of that at all anyway on an animal source-based kind of keto diet.
Now, one caveat of preserved food are the additives. Canned beans, for example, can come with a lot of sodium added, and canned fruit sometimes comes in this sugary, syrupy water. So those are some things to look out for, but in general, frozen fruits and vegetables are pretty good options.
Well, and he brought in some canned fruit there, and it was sugary. Of course, that's going to be off limits on a low carb or even healthy, no sugar added kind of diet. But, I've had people actually, I meet people where they are, and those who don't have much money, they can't afford to go to the farmer's market. They can't afford to have a grass-fed cow and buying half the cow and then putting it in their freezer and noshing on that all winter. I've helped some people who even eat canned foods from the grocery store or canned foods from the convenience store. How could that work? Well, if the carbs are super low, that's the most important thing. These other additives aren't such a big deal if you're losing weight in the context of a low-carb diet. So again, I'm kind of, this isn't the top myth that I wish would be eliminated. As you heard, I wish the keto diet myth would go away. But that said, you're not going to eat much of this unless there are a couple areas on Earth where there's a spam, how should I say, fascination or obsession. I was sent a picture from a colleague who was from Hawaii, and there was a grocery store picture his wife took and sent to us at that meeting. There were, a dozen or 24 different flavors of spam in that section of the grocery store in Hawaii. Apparently, South Korea has a fascination with spam as well. That could actually be healthy in the context of a low-carb diet, even though it's in a can, it's not fresh. So I guess maybe that is an important. Fresh food in general is not necessarily healthier. Let me broaden that out to not just fresh fruit and vegetables, but fresh food itself is not necessarily healthier more than just keeping the carbs low if you're in the context of a low-carb diet.
Myth number 2, all fat is bad. Yeah, this is a relic from the 20th century, from last century, and I still see this here and there on social media. I think what happens is sometimes people lose weight on a low-fat diet, and then they get told, see, it was the fat you took out that's unhealthy. It's not. We can lose weight on all kinds of diets. It doesn't necessarily mean that the thing we left out is automatically unhealthy. You just cut out a source of calories. Eating too many calories is bad for us, whether it's from fat or not. One problem with the fat phobia is people can be drawn to buy and consume ultra-processed foods labeled low-fat or no-fat added and end up eating a lot of refined carbohydrates. I know most viewers of this channel wouldn't fall for that, but that's a pretty common problem. Now, some people like to eat low-fat diets mostly from whole foods, and that's completely fine as a personal preference, but we don't have to fear fat. The question is not so much the amount of fat, it's the type of fat. As the professor of medicine from UCLA who contributed this section writes, saturated and trans fats can increase your risk of heart disease or stroke.
Saturated fats, in my mind, are not anything to be worried about. In fact, that's because I follow the consensus panel of the nutrition experts, not the research experts, not the people pushing different diets. So saturated fat is not a nutrient of concern, but apparently it still is in this myth-busting sort of article. The professor wishes that the people would know that saturated fat's still bad, but mono and polys are okay. Well, Trans fats are lumped into saturated fats here, where they really shouldn't be. The trans fats are added to lots of highly processed foods. I don't know any fat that's naturally occurring that's bad for us, including saturated fat.
While healthy fats like mono and polyunsaturated help reduce risk. So vegetable oils, avocados, nuts, seeds, fatty fish, etc.
So if you're going to focus only on these other, it's a popular internet keto thing to have avocado oil, for example. Well, goodness, in my area, it's pretty expensive. And so it makes it out of reach, the diet plan out of reach for a lot of people if you insist upon asking people to have highly healthier, I don't know if they are, but you think of they're perceived as healthier, yet more expensive oils like that. So this is okay. Any type of naturally occurring fat's all right. And yet the carryover here, the myth, the nutrition expert couldn't quite get to that point that saturated fat's okay.
We've actually covered this topic in a lot of previous content. We went over all the evidence, all the cohort studies, all the trials. So we're not going to spend too much time on this. We're going to move on to myth number 3. And I know there's still uncertainty because we hear all kinds of things on social media, but we're going to keep going over the evidence in the future, and we'll bring on as many lipid researchers as we need so people have clarity and are satisfied on all this. All right, myth number 3, calories in, calories out is the most important factor for long-term weight gain. So this one I found strange. I read it several times. It's still not clear to me exactly what he means. This one was contributed by Dariush Mozaffarian, who's a professor of nutrition at Tufts. And he says the critical thing for weight loss is avoiding ultra-processed foods. I agree with that in general. And he recommends a shift from counting calories to prioritizing healthy eating overall.
So I can explain why calories in, calories out is there as a myth, because that's been around so long. And the idea that what type of calorie you eat has a different metabolic effect or hormonal effect has finally kind of raised in awareness and in appreciation in the minds of these experts in nutrition. In the last few years, Dr. David Ludwig at Harvard has put together some papers where he's gotten all these experts together on the same sheet of music saying, yes, it's about calories, yes, it's about the type of calories, can't we all just agree? But now if you look, Dr. Mozaffarian's very, very influential, and he's a cardiologist by training. I believe I've seen him at meetings and met him a couple times, but you can see now the language is changing to ultra-processed foods, such as refined starchy snacks, cereals, crackers, starches, energy bars, baked goods, bread, sodas and sweets, pastries, bagels, all those. So they can be particularly harmful for weight gain. Yeah, so the carbs are what cause the weight gain. Hooray! And that's the shift that Dr. Mozaffarian's talking about under the guise of calories. No, it's not calories in, calories out anymore. It's actually the type of calorie can matter. So that's a big change, although it may seem obvious to the rest of us. The nutrition scientists were hung up on this thing for decades. And it really kind of closed off the creativity, because if you think about this, if obesity, it's a problem of more calories going in than more calories coming out. We know what causes obesity. People stop thinking. People stop being curious. And nutrition and obesity researchers stopped being curious. Gary Taubes, who is an investigative journalist, a writer, and I've learned so much from his painstaking reviews of science. Put it this way, he asked me, Eric, if I asked you why is that restaurant crowded, and you told me, well, more people went in than came out, I would say, well, that's crazy. Of course, more people went in than came out, but why is it crowded? I mean, is it good service? And I would say back, no, more people went in than came out. That is the reason the restaurant's crowded. Why are you making this more complicated? So we know now that the type of calorie matters, the hormonal effect, and all along, what made the calories go in and not come out, what makes someone not exert as many calories, these are the questions. Is the restaurant having great food, great drinks, a great view? Is the food ultra-processed and sugary and you can't stop eating it because they have focus groups going around the table saying which one of these can you not resist most? And then the companies come out and sell those products. That's a line of books by Michael Moss. Hooked is his last one. Salt, Sugar, and Fat is another one, where we're now understanding a lot of people are hooked on the sugar and ultra-processed food. And I see that as a good change in the messaging from Dr. Mozaffarian.
Quality over quantity. Agree 100%. Focusing on healthy foods tends to take care of the calorie problem. I just think the title is weird, how he worded it. The myth he chose, right? Calories in, calories out being the most important factor for weight gain. That's the top myth for him. It's true that conscious focus on calories doesn't seem helpful for most people, but that doesn't mean calories in, calories out isn't a key factor. In fact, we know that eating ultra-processed foods leads to overconsumption of calories, so they're not mutually exclusive. I think his wording conflates best approaches with what the underlying physiological factors might be. But let me know in the comments if you disagree and if you interpret his words differently. I agree with his bottom line though, minimizing ultra-processed foods in general and focusing on quality foods. It's just, I would have worded the myth as something like focusing on calories is the best approach for weight loss, or trying to eat less is the best approach for weight loss, something like that, and then explain that it's better to focus on eating better instead of eating less.
Yeah, I agree that those would have been better myths, but the context is that Dr. Mozaffarian was kind of playing to the research audience, I believe, that has focused just on the calories in, calories out, and now you have the carbohydrate insulin hypothesis as a explanation for why ultra-processed foods, sugary and starchy foods, are so fattening and lead to diabetes and all that.
Myth number 4, people with type 2 diabetes shouldn't eat fruit. Yeah, this is a pretty common one to hear. I think it comes from fruit containing sugars.
So I totally disagree that this is a myth. People with type 2 diabetes shouldn't eat fruit or shouldn't eat much of it because type 2 diabetes is a problem of too much sugar in the blood. You don't want to be adding sugar in the food and the drinks if you already have high sugar in the blood. And what the studies he cites actually are people who are dealing with mediocrity. The diabetes is not being reversed and eliminated, it's being managed. You may go to a doctor and they don't even talk to you about the food. They might tell you to eat more carbs if you have diabetes, but then they'll diagnose you with things and they'll manage you with drugs. In my clinic, we focus on the food a lot. I might even be a bit of a pest at times about getting the food right, getting the carbs low, but then we don't have to diagnose you with diseases. We could even get you off medications. So it's a different approach. And here, the myth that diabetics shouldn't eat fruit, it's not a myth. I disagree that that's a myth, but let's see the evidence.
Even though they're natural sugars in the food matrix with fiber, but there's this notion that sugars of any source are bad for diabetes. I don't have a 100% black and white position on this.
I do, because I'm a clinician knowing that. So the use of a low-carb or keto diet in the clinic, if you count in my experience over 20 years, Dr. Atkins' experience over 30 years, his era, Dr. Eads, Dr. Atkins, and then going back to the 1920 with the Osler and Allen approaches, low-carb diets, actually it's been known for a long time that people with diabetes can reverse their diabetes and improve it by cutting out sugar, including fruits. So remember, diabetes is a problem of too much sugar in the blood. Don't eat sugar or drink sugar, or you have very small amounts if you do. Well, even better yet, why don't you get a continuous glucose monitor now and you can watch your blood sugar go up after you eat an apple, if that's what you need. If that's what you need to convince you that, oh, I don't know, I don't believe this doctor, I don't believe that one, get yourself a glucose monitor. You don't have to prick your fingers now, and see what happens when you eat that fruit.
The balance of evidence doesn't seem to support that whole fruit is a problem for diabetics.
And here he's reviewing studies that are allowing for mediocrity, the dumbing it down. An A1C of 7 is just fine. No, it's not with type 2 diabetes. Dr. Richard K. Bernstein, Dick Bernstein, a teacher of mine, is now in his late 80s with type 1 diabetes, and he has a motto or a mantra that people with diabetes deserve normal blood sugars. You don't have to have type 2 diabetes.
We know people who eat more fruit tend to have a lower risk of developing type 2 diabetes.
And this is one of those conundrums, I suppose, that among people who eat carbs, those who eat more fruit have less diabetes, but they still have diabetes. So we want to reverse diabetes or make the world a place where there is no diabetes. So if you have trouble, so it doesn't apply to everyone, don't get me wrong, but if you have carbohydrate intolerance, insulin resistance, you have to be very careful about your carbs. And it's apples and oranges, pun intended, when you take a study where people are eating carbs in both groups, and those who eat more fruit don't get diabetes as much. That doesn't apply at all to the context of a super low carb diet where you're reversing type 2 diabetes. So it's too bad that Dr. Carvalho doesn't have the low carb clinical experience to be able to see through this myth.
And type 2 diabetics who eat more fruit tend to have a lower risk of complications and even mortality. Now, we can always argue, well, maybe it's some other healthy habit that they have, it's not the fruit itself. So we also want to see, ideally, when available, some randomized trials.
So that's the healthy user bias. So among people who eat carbohydrates, the percent get diabetes in this group, the percent get diabetes in that group. Those who eat more fruit have less chances of getting the diabetes, but they also do healthy things. You know, you've been taught to eat more fruit. They've been probably taught to have seatbelts on and not eat so much junk food and all these other factors, not smoke as much. And smoking, don't forget, smoking is still a bad actor. So that healthy user bias is true in any kind of comparative study, even if it's observational, so that you're not really controlling people. The randomization is a procedure where you flip a coin to decide who gets in what group, and it's a bias-reducing kind of method or procedure. It's not perfect, but it's a lot better than just saying, you know, how much fruit do you eat and then follow the outcomes without having some sort of experimental intervention.
I've seen a few trials specifically looking at whole fruit separate from vegetables in a population with type 2 diabetes. This one, for example, told half the participants to eat a bit more fruit and the other half to eat a little bit less. And after 3 months, they didn't see a significant difference in body weight or hemoglobin A1C, which is an average of the glucose levels over the long run.
So that study wouldn't apply to my patients who are taught to have no fruit, or a very small amount if you do.
Several caveats of this study that lower my confidence a little. For example, the difference in fruit intake was subtle. Before the trial, they ate about 190 grams of fruit a day, average, which is the equivalent of a medium apple. And during the trial, one group went up to 320 grams a day, and the other came down to 135. So it's like comparing an apple and a half to 2/3 of an apple. So the trial is saying that in the background of a whole dietary pattern, eating a little more than an apple a day versus a little less than an apple in type 2 diabetics doesn't seem to make a big difference for glucose levels.
So if you came to me, I would say that apple, which has a carbohydrate level that is about 20 grams, when you really look at the amount of sugar in it, take away all the fiber, the stem, all that stuff, 20 grams on an apple, that's the limit I would want you to be at for the whole day when you start out on a low-carb keto diet. So to have someone eating more, even more than an apple, is off the scale in terms of how I would treat someone on a keto diet.
And I have no trouble believing that. I'm not knocking the trial. This is a common hurdle, getting people to achieve significantly different levels of intake, what we call contrast of exposure. In an ideal world, we'd like to see one group eat no fruit or close to it, and the other group eat 5 or 6 pieces a day. And if we still see no difference, then that's pretty compelling that fruit by itself doesn't seem to play a huge role. Another source of uncertainty is they don't specify what people ate instead of the fruit. Fruit normally replaces other desserts or snacks. So people cutting back on fruit might eat something worse instead. Another factor to bear in mind is heterogeneity. Just saying fruit is a very large category. I think it's entirely possible that different fruits may have different effects, particularly for people with defective metabolism like diabetics. For example, in this study, blueberries, bananas, apples and pears, and grapefruit were associated with lower type 2 diabetes risk. Peaches and oranges with no significant difference, and cantaloupe was associated with a higher risk of type 2. Usual caveats apply. I'm not saying this demonstrates cause and effect and cantaloupes make us diabetic, but I think this raises the possibility of heterogeneity between fruit types. So what about trials looking at specific fruits? I've seen some with berries, for example, and they generally seem to improve metabolic parameters like glucose, insulin, and inflammatory markers, both in diabetics and in healthy people. I've also seen some trials with grapes meta-analyzed, and they don't find a significant effect on glucose or insulin of whole grapes, although the trials that looked at whole grapes were not in diabetics, they were in healthy people. Also seen a couple trials with dates, generally finding lower glycemia and no significant change in hemoglobin A1C. So the data I've seen doesn't point to a clear issue with fruit in type 2 diabetics, with the usual uncertainty around types of fruit and amount and replacement, etc.
Oh, well, I guess now that I think about it, the studies that we did going back 20 years, comparing a low-carb diet where there was no fruit allowed to a low-fat diet where we didn't tell people to eat fruit, but many of them did. When you cut the carbs down to 20 per day and you didn't allow any fruit at all, the differences were huge. So in study after study after study, there's more weight loss in low-carb diets than in diets that we called them low-fat diets, but they contained fruit. And we even limited the calorie levels on those fruit-containing diets. We didn't on the low-carb diets. That's another advantage of a low-carb diet for a long-term lifetime. You don't have much hunger. You don't need to be beholden to worry about where your next meal is coming from. But so in our studies for type 2 diabetes, ours goes back 15 years. The Verta Health studies, which are larger trials more recently, you can eliminate and reverse type 2 diabetes, not just lower the risk. You can reverse diabetes by cutting all of the fruit out, I suppose. So anyway, these studies are not helpful in the context of low-carb diets. You can find your own glucose response to berries or fruits by checking your own blood sugar by a continuous glucose monitor or finger checks. The Keto Mojo will allow you to finger check the glucose and the ketones. Or you can just trust me that if you stay under about 20 or 30 total grams of carbs per day, that will keep the carbs down sufficiently low that your body will burn its own fat because you're just not giving much carbohydrate for it to eat. The type 2 diabetes is a problem of too much sugar. In fact, it used to be called sugar diabetes. I wish it was called sugar diabetes to keep the focus on reducing the sugar. Fruit is one form of sugar. If someone really pushes me and says, well, I need my fruit or my berry, okay, count the carbs. It's always quantify the carbs if you're going to eat off the plan. A fist is roughly a cupful. Compare your fist to a measuring cup. So half of a fist, or 2 knuckles, learned that from the Scotch drinkers, I believe, the fingers, and then 1/4 cup, 1 knuckle, the volume of a fist, and 1 knuckle is a 1/4 cup. A 1/4 cup of berries, 1/4 cup of fruit. Doesn't really matter if it's grapefruit or cantaloupe, it's all about the same. Although there are grapefruits on diets for weight loss. Remember those grapefruit diets? Because it does have a little less sugar in it. But count 1/4 cup of fruit or berries as 5 carbs. And if you can stay to that, this will probably work. Your body will look around, burn the carbs, and then will take the fat off its own. Take your fat off your body to burn it, because there's just not much carbohydrate in the daily food and drink consumption. So if you find that 1/4 cup of berries or fruit, so that's 1/4 of an apple, 1/4 of a fruit, if you find that makes you eat more and you can't stop, can't have it yet. That's called a trigger food, and I don't want you to expose yourself to trigger foods, especially at the beginning of this process, because it's just going to make it harder for you.
As we discussed recently with Dr. Nicola Guess, the main factor for type 2 diabetes remission is weight loss. And people have different strategies for that. Some people put type 2 diabetes in remission with high fruit diets, others with low carb diets, where they have some low carb fruits like berries, and they generally avoid more sugary fruits like mangoes and bananas.
I might add, though, that the high carb diets, with the fruit diets, they have to be explicitly low in calories or be so filling that the calories will be kept down in order for that person to lose the weight. But if all you did is have fruit, you're not going to be getting all the essential nutrients. So I'm assuming that's not a total fruit diet. The essential nutrients, protein being what we're made of. Protein is the most important nutrient that you probably want to consume every day. That's one of the kind of nitpicky things I have with the people saying total fasting, for days or weeks, because we still think that protein for optimal health should be consumed frequently. But we don't really know, but new science, in my mind, has to be generated to tell me that it's okay for you to go for a long time without protein.
Both approaches can work, at least for weight loss and type 2 diabetes remission. So overall, I agree the statement diabetics shouldn't eat fruit is not supported by the evidence. At the same time, I don't think it's unreasonable necessarily for some diabetics to choose a strategy where they focus on specific fruits, or even where they reduce the amount of fruit they were eating before, depending on specifics. I think it's less about whether you eat fruit or not, and more about what you eat instead. I think this gets into the obsession with glucose levels to the point where we lose track of big picture, overall health, including glucose levels, and dietary pattern, healthy overall, whether it includes a little bit more or a little bit less fruit. Okay, myth number 5. Plant milk is healthier than cow milk. And the professor who wrote this one, she's very categorical. She says, it's just not true. I'm less sure than she is. I would say that I'm agnostic on this question because I just haven't seen health outcome data on plant milks. And I see a lot of people jumping to conclusions on this. It seems to be a very emotional issue. Some people saying, well, of course the plant milk is going to be healthier. It's from a plant, it's not from an animal. And some people saying the opposite. Of course it's going to be unhealthier. It's a processed food. I don't find either of these arguments compelling. It's not true that all animal foods are unhealthy, or even that all processed foods are unhealthy. So to me, it just sounds like logical leaps. It's one thing to say, my general strategy is to avoid processed foods. Cool, don't see a problem with that. Or, in general, ultra-processed foods aren't great staples. Agree with that. It's a completely different statement to say, we know that this product is less healthy than that product when we lack the evidence for it. It's okay to say, we don't know. We should normalize saying, we don't have the data on that yet. We're waiting.
So I wish there was some comment or consideration of the number of carbs in the milk. Milk in the context of a low-carb diet milk is out because milk is where the sugar is, the lactose. So 2%, so skim milk is the worst. They've skimmed the cream off. 2%, they add some fat back to it. And so half and half in heavy cream are the dairy milk-like sources that you would want on a low-carb diet. Now, there are these unsweetened nut milks and plant milks. We don't know a whole lot about it. I have to agree Dr. Carvalho, that we don't understand the effects of those things, and there is sort of a knee-jerk acceptance that anything plant-based is fine, right? People in the True Initiative take a pledge that say they think everything plant-based, or a different word, plant predominant was the term they used. No, we don't know that it's necessarily healthy, and I teach people the most important thing is to look at the carbs. Look at the total grams, not net. I know a lot of folks use net carbs, and it might work for a while, but if it stops working, switch over to total carbs. It means less carbs and no keto junk foods that are out there. And using real food is really important to me because you can know exactly how many carbs are in the foods that you're eating.
We don't have to rush to form an unshakable opinion on every question before we go through the evidence. I know that's what social media promotes, the algorithm, but I don't think that's very productive. Now, the writer of this section offers a couple arguments. One is protein content, which is higher in cow milk than in almond or oat milk. But for example, soy milk has as much protein as cow milk. Depending on the brand, it even has more. I just don't think protein content necessarily equates with healthier product. Now, if you have someone getting a substantial amount of their protein from cow milk, and they do a one-to-one swap, volume for volume, with oat milk, and they don't change anything else about their diet, yeah, you might run into some problems there, especially if it's like a child, right? So I agree with that. I just don't think it's as simple as this food is healthier, period. The scientist also points out many plant milks have added stuff like sodium and added sugars. I think it's totally fine to point that out and to bear that in mind. It just doesn't tell me which product is healthier. Which milk product leads to better health? I don't know. Happy to lean in either direction when the solid evidence comes out. I don't consume either one, so I don't have a horse in this race. And honestly, it wouldn't surprise me if the data pointed in either direction or if the data showed that they're about equal. None of it would blow me away. Bottom line, if the argument is that assuming plant milk must be healthier is not justified, then I agree. Myth number 6, white potatoes are bad for you.
Wait, that's not a myth? I don't agree with this one either.
This is another one where I don't quite share the level of confidence of the writer to make this a top myth. In part, potatoes get a bad rep because in the West, most people tend to eat them fried. When method of preparation is accounted for, French fries are associated with worse outcomes.
So that's interesting because I blame the potato, not the frying of the potato. And I know the potatoes are in different forms. Remember, they're French fries, they're cottage fries, they're mashed potatoes. So the amount of potatoes really matters when you're on a low-carb diet. Remember the fruit that I wanted to be really careful of if you had diabetes? The fruit has about 20 carbs and about a fistful or an apple, a fruit, an apple. Well, potatoes, pasta, rice, it has 40 carbs per cup. So look it up. Look, and so that's even twice as much carbs. So, I can teach people the nuance of counting carbs. No, at first I teach people to just keep the carbs low. Don't have any potatoes. Just don't go there. Well, can't I have, one French fry? No, because for most people, that's a trigger food. And you can't just eat one French fry, especially if it comes in a pack with 20 or 40 other French fries. So I don't blame the method of processing here. I think that's been a big red herring in terms of general health. It doesn't matter how the food's cooked.
As far as non-fried, baked or boiled or mashed potatoes, I've seen a bit of mixed evidence. Many studies don't show a significant effect, but I've seen one or two that show a statistically significant increase in, for example, risk of type 2 diabetes with intake of non-fried potatoes. Lots of uncertainty with this, very small effect. Haven't seen any trials pointing in the same direction. Could it be the gravy or the sour cream or whatever people put on potatoes? Absolutely. If I had to guess, a baked potato or a boiled potato here and there in a healthy dietary pattern, I'd be surprised if it's a big deal, but I'm not at this level of confidence. I wouldn't put it as a top myth. Open to being convinced though. if there's a strong balance of evidence?
So I want you to have the sour cream, not the baked potato. Well, this brings up the idea that what's wrong, what's healthy is context dependent. And I like that about Dr. Carvalho. So on a low carb diet, you don't eat potatoes or fruit. It's not that they're not healthy. They can't be healthy in a different context if you have a different metabolism. If you don't have type 2 diabetes, go ahead and have some fruit. It doesn't raise your blood sugar because your blood insulin can go up and keep it down. So when you're driving on the right-hand side of the road, as we do in the US, you stay to the right of the marker. You get in the car actually on the left side of the car where the steering wheel is, and try driving in a different country where the steering wheel is on the wrong side. Sorry, apologies to all of you who drive on the left-hand side of the road, but it seems weird. It seems you get in the wrong side of the car because the steering wheels, and then you're so close to the line, of course it's going to feel weird. So first, when you start a low-carb diet, I can't have bread, my bread. This is just the rules of the road. Right, the rules of a low-carb diet is you don't have those things for a while. The hunger cravings go away remarkably fast. It's great when people come in and go, this has been really easy. Why didn't I do this years ago? And I'm like, I don't know. Why didn't you? All these other myths and all. No, potatoes, you want to be very careful about. Potatoes are great in a famine. They will keep you alive. But once you get enough protein from other sources and you're beyond a subsistence level, protein comes first, and potatoes, pasta, rice, fruit, all these other sugary, starchy sources can overcome the health of the individual, lead to obesity, type 2 diabetes. It's a pretty cogent argument now, going on the carbohydrate insulin hypothesis of obesity and type 2 diabetes, which is now on par with the calories in, calories out. Even Dr. Mozaffarian wished the calories in, calories out myth would go away. I'm glad there's a perception that potatoes might be something you don't want to have too much. So I disagree with that as being a myth.
Myth number 7, never give peanuts to small kids. Right, this used to be the recommendation, but it changed. There was a fascinating randomized trial published in 2015. Giving little kids under 1 year old peanut products like peanut butter lowered their risk of developing peanut allergy by several fold. It was a stunning result. As a result of this trial and other evidence, the guidelines changed, and introduction of peanut products early on is now recommended, especially in kids with eczema and other hints that they might go on to develop a peanut allergy. There's even some evidence that existing peanut allergy can be put in remission with a very gradual, very careful reintroduction of the allergen, of peanut proteins. We've covered this in previous videos. There's some very striking evidence showing 74% of kids with peanut allergies achieving remission after this treatment. Obviously, if your child has peanut allergy, don't start giving them peanuts on your own randomly without medical supervision. All right? This is a very specific, very careful process. I'm going to say that again. Do not give kids with peanut allergies peanuts on your own randomly without medical supervision. But in general, introducing these foods early in life is now recommended, and it's thought not only to not be a problem, but to actually reduce the risk of developing the allergy.
Well, that's interesting. Not being a pediatrician, that was news to me. I didn't know that people were not letting kids have peanuts. So it makes sense to me that you want to have a little bit of that antigen around when you're young so you can develop a tolerance to it. Certainly if you're an adult and you have peanut allergies, stay away from peanuts or go through some desensitization like that. It's not one of my top myths, but perhaps in the pediatric world that is a big one.
Myth number 8, plant protein is incomplete. This one was contributed by Christopher Gardner, who is a Stanford professor, and we had him on not too long ago on the channel. We're not going to spend a ton of time on this because we have a lot of videos going into this in detail. All plants contain all 9 essential amino acids. It's the proportion that varies. If your whole diet is one plant all day, every day, like in some developing countries, 80% of the calories come from wheat, yeah, you might run into problems. You might not get enough of some essential amino acids. Otherwise, if you have a diverse diet, some vegetables, some beans, some grains, and you're getting enough calories, not a problem. There are a lot of trials now looking at muscle growth, which is a pretty high bar for protein adequacy, and even comparing people getting all of their protein from plants versus omnivores. They don't find a statistically significant difference in muscle growth as long as people are getting enough protein overall. One amino acid that seems particularly important is leucine, so see our protein videos for more details on that.
Well, so that's interesting. I was taught that you need to have certain combinations of vegetables to be sure that you get all of the essential amino acids that you need. That's where beans and rice come into play. And when I am teaching someone who only wants to get their protein from vegetable sources, there are certain kind of rules that you come up with. Maybe it's so basic now that beans and rice, it's so common, you'll get all of the, if you think of that as your vegetable source, you'll get all of the amino acids. But the converse to that, though, the flip side is that if you do eat animal products, there's never a need to worry about essential amino acids because the mammals and animals have everything that you need, fish, shellfish, eggs as well. So I guess it's trying to trying to pave the way toward more of a plant-based universe. Plant, I forget what the phrase was.
Myth number 9, soy raises risk of breast cancer. Yeah, this is a common one to hear. These concerns with soy and hormones stem from the fact that soy contains phytoestrogens, which are molecules that bear some resemblance to mammalian estrogen. And we have a whole video on this looking at testosterone levels and man boobs and all that. The key to this whole dilemma is that phytoestrogens are kind of like a two-faced molecule. In some tissues, they act like estrogen, while in other tissues, they do the opposite. So we actually have to look at what happens in a living, breathing human in order to know what the health effect of the food is. Studies find, if anything, an inverse correlation between breast cancer and consumption of soy and isoflavones, which are some of these phytoestrogens in soy. So people eating the most soy, the most isoflavones have, if anything, lower risk of breast cancer, better survival rates, and lower risk of recurrence. And the trials that have been carried out looking at breast cancer markers also don't support the notion that soy or isoflavone consumption promotes breast cancer growth. Concerns about soy and hormones also stem from some work in mice showing faster tumor growth. The problem is also mice are known to process isoflavones differently from humans. So it's just another example that animal research can be very important for hypothesis generation, but it doesn't necessarily reflect what happens in a human. So at the end of the day, we want to look at human data. I would summarize the evidence conservatively. I would say the balance of evidence does not support this concern with soy and breast cancer.
Well, so let's just think about that a minute. First of all, in the context of a low-carb diet, adding these different things like soy, milk, and all may have different effects. So the research that has been done may not apply at all. And then, but then it seems to me that this is a myth that's trying to get you to eat more processed foods, to get more of the soy milk and things like that. If you ate a little bit of tofu, for example, in the context of a diet, I'm not sure there's much harm there. So that's interesting that that's a myth that certainly for those who are consuming carbs, maybe they're having lots of soy, worrying about that. I'm not worrying about that much.
And finally, myth number 10, nutrition advice keeps changing. Professor Marion Nessel explains that since the 1950s, dietary recommendations have been basically similar on the fundamentals, not going overboard on calories and minimizing saturated fat and added salt and sugar. Of course, there's lots of research ongoing, and nutrition scientists are not unemployed, and views on specific questions evolve, just like we saw with the peanut example and timing of introduction for kids. But the notion that nutrition science as a whole, the whole field keeps doing 180s every week is just not true. Headlines and social media can give that impression, but that's not an accurate reflection of how science in general evolves. Now, I've noticed a lot of people asking this question recently. If the guidelines have been the same, essentially the same, for decades, and if we're getting sicker, at least in the West, especially in the US, doesn't that mean the guidelines are wrong? So we have a whole video addressing this question coming very soon, so stay tuned.
So getting back to the myth that the guidelines haven't changed, well, they should. There shouldn't be guidelines. I take issue with Professor Nessel. In fact, never met her, even though we've been in obesity meetings. I'm more in the practical treatment side than in the let's figure out what causes it. I'm in the let's figure out what fixes it side of meetings, the practical physicians trying to work in the trenches with people. And did you notice in the guideline, it still had that residual eating saturated fat is bad for you? That's got to go. So yes, the guidelines should change. Well, it reminds me sort of the business thing that the overnight success has actually been around for 10 years. So it's very rare for a business to just pop up like they've been at it for a long time, and then finally there's a spike in their success. So the guidelines, the percolation, the removal of saturated fat, the focus on ultra-processed food, it is changing. And although, but in the defense of the former creators of guidelines and writers, maybe the food supply has changed. And now you have much more sugar and ultra-processed food in the grocery stores. You can't get past the checkout without some sort of candy bar or something that you certainly don't need. But I don't know. It would be just fine with me if there were no guidelines for nutrition in the U.S. The U.S. doesn't have to be involved. In fact, looking at the writing of some investigative journalists and people who are into this deeper than I, it seemed to have been an industry idea to get the government involved so that government could promote the foods that America makes. Unfortunately, the food that America makes over the last, my lifetime, has not necessarily been the healthiest food. I want to get it back to real food. Meat, poultry, fish, and shellfish, and eggs. And, be very careful about any sort of highly processed food in the middle of that grocery store that you go to. Well, I thought that was interesting. I liked Dr. Cavajo's approach. He didn't know about our low-carb diet studies, but that's fine. I don't know about all the studies other people talk about. And this is nutrition made simple. That's a lot to take on. But if you like this, of course, press like, subscribe so you don't miss out on other future videos. Send me some videos to go over. I find the ones that you send me are particularly useful. I want ones that are making you afraid or fear-mongering so I can relieve your anxiety about that best I can. And the idea that you can go for a while without eating junk food, without eating carbs, the idea that we all go into nutritional ketosis if you don't eat for 3 days because you're burning your own body fat. You can then go to the next step. Everyone goes into nutritional ketosis if you don't eat carbs for 3 days. The idea that this is something unhealthy just doesn't make sense. This wouldn't have been perpetuated for so long to be a fat burner if you didn't have food around. That's called nutritional ketosis. So don't be afraid of ketosis. Until the next time. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. And check out adaptyourlifeacademy.com.